afternoon and welcome to this evening panel on Asia's new normal. Many of you have asked me what this new normal is about. The new normal is about this huge endeavor by many actors in Asia to integrate Asia, to connect people, to connect businesses, to connect opportunities. Even as this happens, there are contests, there are conflicts, there are some tensions, there are some collateral damages, there are financial implications. And this particular panel will seek to engage with this new normal that we are witnessing in Asia. Let me first very quickly introduce the speakers this afternoon, a very eminent panel. To my left is Ambassador Leena Ponnappa, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor of India and a career diplomat. To her left is Dr. Shashi Tharoor, one of India's most famous voices, and certainly he knows a bit about foreign policy as well. He's the chair of the External Affairs, he's the chair of the Standing Committee of the External Affairs Ministry in Parliament, and has been writing and speaking on these matters for a very long time. To his left is Mr. Shahidul Haq, the Foreign Secretary of Bangladesh, a country which is keenly engaged with many connectivity projects and seeks to change their own national destiny and economic prospects using many of the new infrastructure opportunities available to them. And to his left is Suhasini Haidar, one of India's finest diplomatic editors. She writes for The Hindu and is frequently visible on various international platforms which discuss geoeconomics and geopolitics. They are going to address three core questions around connectivity. First, how do we balance national sovereignty and the imperatives of economic integration? Second, how do you navigate the politics and economics of one project, which is the Belt and Road Initiative? But of course, I invite them all to go beyond the BRI and to look at some other initiatives as well. And finally, is there a golden median? Is there a formula where we can create sustainable investment, ethical investment, that is not going to burden the country that is going to be the recipient of some of these projects? So let me first invite them all to share their thoughts on this big question for, say, between 3 and 5 minutes, and then I will try and make it more lively by provoking them with taking positions that might be slightly uncomfortable for them. So Ambassador Ponnappa, let me begin with you. The big question now.
Big question, okay. I'm going to start with a few general observations. Well, for courtesies, let me thank ORF, IAS for, and the World Economic Forum for bringing me into this India Economic Summit. A great pleasure to discuss a subject which I believe has engaged many people in the past, continues to do so even now, and will in the future. I have a few general observations before I go to the specific question of balancing national sovereignty and what's called the imperative of economic integration. First, I'm not sure that this is a new normal. In fact, I do believe that it is an old normal with fresh dimensions, because history shows us that large-scale connectivity on a continental scale has existed in the past and is intrinsically linked to geopolitics. Witness the roads of the Mauryan Empire in our own neighborhood, 3rd century BC, the roads of the Roman Empire, 3rd century BC, the Mongolian Empire, the largest empire that history has ever known over the 12th to the 15th centuries, spanning Eurasia, from China all the way across to Central Europe. And just a few hundred years in the past, again in our own locality, the Grand Trunk Road, which continues to exist, built by Sher Shah Suri in the 16th century. So we're really talking about an old normal, fresh dimensions being everything that technology has brought up in terms of connectivity, the speed of transport, and so on. Now, within this, how do you balance national sovereignty and economic integration? These are terms that we hear bandied around. Some of them are treated as inevitable, but like democracy, nothing is inevitable. You've got to work at it. All interstate agreements involve a degree of voluntary compromise of sovereignty, given mutual obligations and commitments based on a common interest. This is the very foundation of diplomacy, based on the expectation and hopefully and ideally trust that both sides will not only jointly devise the rules of the game, but will also abide by them. And economic integration, as a subset of the larger degree of interstate engagement, does not come easily, since even within a country, however small, local and regional interests become active stakeholders. We're seeing this in India today with the whole debate on the GST and the variable rates and so on, but it happens in every country. Economic integration among states involves very long and arduous negotiations. Witness the 50 years that it took to put the WTO in place. This was the third pillar of the post-World War II international order. Security came in through the UN and the Security Council. The monetary institutions of the World Bank and the IMF were in position, but the WTO took 50 long years. And in larger countries, in continental countries, the variables are even more numerous and complicated. The challenges before the EU, the developments involving a host of regional PTAs, including the TPP and the RCEP, indicate that the very delicate equilibrium between a comfort level with the preservation of national security vis-à-vis economic integration is yet to be found and will always be questioned, whatever the nature of any government. This is an ongoing process. There is a continuum. And in a multilateral context, one other factor comes in, namely that domination or hegemony is not acceptable. And there is therefore wisdom in hastening at a sustainable pace, developing consensus both internally and externally through a building block approach, which can be perceived as benign, if not beneficial. Now, Asia has been doing this over the past few decades on a building block basis, and India's own learning curve on this. Do we have time for that, or should I come back to that?
I'll come back to
Okay.
India.
And Europe's experience shows that when the ground is not fully prepared, when the agenda moves faster than the comfort level, the best of plans can backfire, and sovereignty issues become the driving imperative.
Thank you, ma'am. Foreign Secretary Haq, Bangladesh is in the midst of many connectivity projects, India's, China's, and some of the other regional initiatives. How do you respond to this dimension of sovereignty versus economic growth?
Thank you very much. I think as a state, like any other country, we also try and balance between national sovereignty and economic integration, and it's not something new. But in the process, we realize that the concept and the practice of national sovereignty has gone through fundamental changes. Now we see that the way it was initially conceived, that a state will exercise its sovereign rights on many things, we don't see that anymore, because economic issues sometimes also dictate as to how much sovereignty you would exercise and how much you let it go. For that matter, Ambassador has already mentioned about the trade issues. On the trade, the states have very limited sovereignty, if I'm allowed to use the word, and in many other issues. But the fundamental struggle between sovereignty versus economic interest, not only in the international arena, but also within the country, how much you will allow your citizens to enjoy economic freedom or political freedom versus the sovereignty and control of the state, continues to remain a vital issue. In case of Bangladesh, I think quite early in our days, we realized that sovereignty is important. We are both geographically and otherwise small, but we have, in order to overcome that limitations, we have to link ourselves with the rest of the world. And that's why economy and the social issues and political issues remain very fundamental to our state practices, irrespective of governments. And one of the issues that we attach huge priority is how do we overcome our limitations? It is not by holding on to so-called sovereignty through a control mechanism, but rather opening up. And that's why we have opened up much earlier than many of the countries in South Asia. And we see that it brought benefit for our people. So the government, the current government of Awami League run by the Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, then we cannot be isolated in the name of sovereignty. We cannot remain kind of linkless in the current situations. We have to go beyond by linking ourselves with our neighbors far and beyond, and that's what we think would eventually bring benefit to us. So we look at sovereignty and integration rather in a different angle than
As complementary. So if you
as-
grow
not,
as you,
not
as
only
you,
not only as complementary. I think there are times when we have to put the sovereignty issue, control issues, little back in the seat and bring in the economic integration front.
okay. So economy first, let's grow.
Exactly.
And of course, as you grow bigger, you're likely to have greater resources to manage sovereignty itself. Shashi, your take on this.
Well, I think both Ambassador Ponnappa and Foreign Secretary Hawke have very clearly enunciated the principles that matter, and I can only happily endorse all of them. I would point to, however, some of the bad news around. I mean, there's no question that, as the World Bank put it, we in South Asia are the world's least integrated region, the least integrated region in every conceivable sense. In fact, if you look at trade, since trade was mentioned, the ASEAN countries, their trade amongst each other, the countries of ASEAN, is 25% of their total global trade. Whereas the South Asian countries and SAARC, our trade amongst each other is only 5% of our total global trade. So we are simply not integrated economically. We're not trading with each other enough. Now, there have been some fitful steps in various directions. There are a handful of free trade agreements, as the SAFTA, which came out of SAARC, but which is honored in the breach by most countries. There's been a free trade agreement that was invented not too long ago amongst the South Asian countries, amongst BIMSTEC countries, where all this is actually promoted trade is difficult to effectively pinpoint. So what is clearly missing here is the political will to promote more integration. And we ran into a very interesting example of the challenges facing politicians when the BBIN sub-region, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal, signed in 2015 a motor vehicles agreement. And Bangladesh and India and Nepal decided to go ahead and implement it. Essentially would have permitted free passage of vehicles, including trucks, from each of these countries into the others. Suddenly in Bhutan, in the fledgling democracy which is opening up its space, this became a hot button political issue. As on the one hand, Bhutanese truckers said that these trucks coming in from India and Bangladesh and Nepal are going to swamp our roads and deprive us of business and throw Bhutanese truck drivers into unemployment. And then you also had the ecologists and the environmentalists saying, can you imagine all these vehicles coming in and spoiling our environment by chugging their diesel fumes into our air? And suddenly, this becomes a debate in the Bhutanese parliament, and the Bhutanese parliament votes against ratifying this agreement. I was in Bhutan briefly while some of this excitement was going on. And at some level, as a politician, I couldn't help sympathizing with the Bhutanese politicians' vote on this, because essentially, politicians in democracies can't afford to think of the bigger picture at the expense of their immediate political reality. And this is something I think we all have to very honestly face up to for ourselves. In a small democracy like Bhutan, people just beginning to be conscious of their rights, this agreement alone could have potentially resulted in a backlash against the government, could perhaps even have brought down the government. Who are we to sit in a country like India or even Bangladesh, is also a pretty large country in terms of population, and say, you know, we must take the larger picture and look in terms of collective integration when size becomes a factor. And when it comes to size, look at us. You sit around the table in South Asia with the other members of SAARC, we can't help the fact that we account for 70% of the population and 80% of the GDP of all the SAARC countries put together. So inevitably, even if we speak in whispers, our voice, our elbows, our waistline are going to drown out everybody else's. And this becomes, again, a real challenge in promoting integration. There is, in a sense, with ASEAN, a slightly simpler thing in that no one economy in ASEAN is that much larger than any of the others. Whereas here in South Asia, we have a giant and a number of countries, some medium-sized, some small, and finding a formula for coexistence is therefore a challenge. I'm not here just to pour, to rain water on this parade, because I actually agree with the principles enunciated by both the speakers on either side of me, but rather to the point to the fact, A, that we haven't really got as far as we claim we have, generally speaking, and secondly, there are good reasons why it's not going to be easy for us to get that far. Now, the final point I wanted to make is about the plethora of institutions in our sub-region and our region. I mentioned BBIN. I mentioned SAARC. There's BIMSTEC, which is, as you know, now 20 years old, and which some have seen, especially last year, when the SAARC summit collapsed in the welter of recrimination over Pakistani-supported terrorist activities. There was a brief thought that BIMSTEC might be an alternative to SAARC, because it was SAARC minus Pakistan and unfortunately minus Maldives as well, and plus Thailand and Sri Lanka, Thailand and Myanmar, right? So that essentially you have SAARC plus and minus at least one of the countries that was preventing agreement consensually on many issues. Now, when that kind of thing came up, there should have been then a flurry of BIMSTEC-related activity. Has there been? If there has, I haven't noticed it. I don't know if the serving diplomat to my left or the former diplomat to my right will have more knowledge of this. But if you are a diligent reader of the newspapers, as Suhasini is a writer for the newspapers, I think you will have to admit that after BIMSTEC was brought to Goa and paraded for a certain political effect, that we've never heard about it since. So, coming right back to the and there's one more group which I forgot, the South, what is it called? The South Asian Sub-Regional Economic Cooperation, or SASEC, which is a program of the ADB, and which includes, again, the BBIN countries, plus Sri Lanka and Maldives. So we've got quite a smorgasbord of options. To my mind, that is itself a deficiency. On the one hand, it shows how polyvalent we are. We can join all of them. But on the other hand, it also shows that there isn't anymore one entity, as SAARC briefly had promised to be, in which we can devote a certain amount of energy and political commitment to actually using it as a vehicle for economic regional integration.
Suhasini, your take.
I'd like to, if possible, because the specifics have already been dealt with when it comes to looking at sovereignty versus looking at economics. The truth is, in today's world, and I don't just mean roads and highways or ports, I mean the entire lot, which means cyber connectivity, broadband connectivity. When you're looking at oil pipelines, those same pipelines will see a fiber optic go on the side of it. So what you're seeing around the world is that connectivity is really currency. It's a currency that you are using right now in terms of projects that you want to do around the world. And the worth of a nation increasingly will be decided by just how much of a hub it is. In a way, maybe in the 1960s, you looked at a Beirut or you looked at a London as a hub, as an airport hub. Now it is countries that will be connectivity hubs that will see the highest currency as a region. And I think we have to understand that reality when we look at sovereignty. Sovereignty is essentially a 19th century thing, when the world was being redrawn, and it is a legacy that we carry over, things that we have to sort out. But as the Foreign Secretary says, are you going to hold yourself back with it? So that's one part of the question. The truth is that a lot of these projects are simply what they are. It's a road project through Kazakhstan, or it's a railway project that connects two countries. Are you going to not take one country that stays out of the larger, say, Belt and Road Initiative or one of the other initiatives? Is that not going to benefit? They are. So I think what we do is by making it an issue of sovereignty, we kind of overhype its value to us. However, I do think, and obviously we are talking, when we say connectivity, we say Belt and Road, because the others seem to be a no-brainer. There aren't people, out on the street sort of fighting against any of the other big projects or having concerns about the projects in the way we heard the United States, which is not even connected to the Belt and Road in any shape, way, or form, expressing its concerns just 2 days ago about the hegemonistic angle of the Belt and Road, or speaking about the lack of transparency or the fact that it goes through disputed areas. If we do accept that there are these concerns even today, then what is the solution? And I think that's where we should focus a lot of our efforts, in the idea that this should not just be about a political stand, but about a success of diplomacy. When it came to the Belt and Road, and as far as India was concerned, if sovereignty was an issue, India could have raised it in 2015 and said, we're out of this, right? But we didn't. We waited. We waited for more information.
Some would argue we waited for the Chinese to be more reflexive and to
Sure.
accommodate Indian
So we gave them
interests.
2 years to do it.
Sure.
So it is a failure then of the Chinese diplomacy. They had options as well. Could they have moved the Belt and Road that they saw out of the disputed area? After all, there is only one disputed area.
No, it could have been an independent project. It need not have been put into the
And
mainstream.
made the disputed area project something separate, taken the line through Afghanistan, for example. Could they have changed the name and not made it about the country, say that this is a Pakistani project, therefore giving Pakistan the ownership? But were we the only country that didn't have that had a sovereignty issue? No. Afghanistan has a sovereignty issue. They continue to not recognize.
Afghanistan has
the
a sovereignty issue with many countries.
No, but it
let
has
me
a
pose-
sovereignty issue with exactly the same project we do. So all I want to end over here by saying is that we do have to start taking the bigger picture. If there are issues, there are solutions. And unless we are able to see a thrust on diplomacy, rather than make it just about sovereignty versus economics, we are just going to keep going around in the same cycle, wasting a lot of our money on competing and wasting a lot of our money in duplicating what the other is doing.
Okay, so I think this is a good time to pose questions to all of you. Let me start with Suhasini, because I think she's touched on two important aspects. One is, in a sense, you implied that even countries who are not connected are now passing judgments or commenting on the Belt and Road scheme. And there is one school of thought which says that it is because for every port that the Belt and Road Initiative puts out, the Americans have to clean the mess. The Bretton Woods institutions will have to bail them out. So even as Sri Lanka was building Hambantota, the IMF was planning the next bailout stimulus. So the Americans have a right to be involved. So one is, can really this Belt and Road Initiative be an Asian project, or can the connectivity we seek to create in Asia be insular and be self-contained to the region, or other powers will have to act? That's one part. And the second is, all the proponents of the connectivity projects who promote the connectivity projects are as vociferous in their in being against trade projects. So what is the use of connecting countries when you're going to be against the trade agreements that the countries will have to sign to make the roads work?
All right. I think your second point is actually fairly interesting and is almost the subject of another discussion altogether. But on your first point, I will say again, we tend to mix up a lot of these issues. For example, when we say that Sri Lanka is seeing all these projects, the fact is the Belt and Road, which is still a very amorphous creation, right? It's still something that we're talking about. We don't yet actually have an official map of the Belt and Road, for example. But we do know that in each of these countries, whether it's Bangladesh, whether it is Sri Lanka, whether it's Pakistan, whether it's Central Asia, specific projects in each of those countries have already been allocated or have already been spoken about. So what we are seeing is a lot of national projects with the hope that they will connect up with each other. I think what we tend to do is therefore to say that it is a Chinese, China is building this. Whereas what we actually should be saying is Sri Lanka is building this, and Sri Lanka took a loan in order to do this. Sri Lanka used a so-and-so company in order to do this. I think you can't get a better example than Bangladesh on the ability to use all of this for projects for themselves. India is right now talking about restoring the old railway connections inside Bangladesh. At the same time that China is talking about building new railroad connections. They're both connections. And the moment we make it about China is building in Bangladesh, we're taking away from the fact that Bangladesh is actually building its infrastructure. So I do want to make that distinction, because this idea that the Western world is going to come in and have to bail out the Eastern world because, of course, China is going to leave everyone high and dry. I mean, I beg to differ. There is a colonial past to a lot of this, which Shashi is the real expert on, where I don't think it necessarily...
Don't provoke him, he'll write another book. But
or give another...
So, no, but my point on the second part, your newspaper, for example, was one of the few media that supported India joining the belt, or took a nuanced position and said India should sign up. But your newspaper is the loudest in preventing India from signing trade agreements. So I think there is a certain degree of hypocrisy in our integration ideas, that we don't want to do trade deals, but we want to promote roads which will have no goods flowing on them.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you want, I'm not sure our position is anti-free trade at all. But I will certainly say that everyone is working their way out of free trade agreements. It's not just India. There is no great proponent of free trade agreements anywhere in the world. America is not a driver. China is certainly not a driver. It is a beneficiary of many of the free trade agreements that we are either walking away from or America is walking away from. But they are not proponents of it either.
If there could be free trade agreements in services, we'd be in favor of it.
That's exactly. I mean, India's
There are
position
no free
against
trade.
India's position against free trade agreements is essentially one of the duplicity in the fact that our services are not welcome. You don't want our people, but you do want to send your goods here. So I do think that all of these issues are going to become more and more complicated if we make them just about nationalism, if we just make them about sovereignty, when in actual fact, everyone's doing trade with everyone, everyone's building roads with everyone, everyone wants access to everyone's ports.
So let me come to Shashi. Shashi, you mentioned size. Now, unfortunately, we have another actor who is also big, in fact, four times bigger than us.
Bigger.
And how does that size change our conception of integration, of allowing the Asian Connectivity Project or supporting it, rather?
I genuinely don't think it was China's size that put us off. I mean, I honestly think that one of the reasons for the delayed pullout, though Suhasini is right to point it out, was we were waiting to see the extent to which this project would turn out to be all about China's greater glory and China's spendable surplus and China's geopolitical interests as opposed to collective benefit. And that's where I think Suhasini is being a little too kind to the Chinese on this. I mean, one of the unreported stories of this One Belt, One Road is how they officially changed the name. Did they all pay attention to that? They said One Belt, One Road was causing some worry, so they changed it to the Belt and Road Initiative. Because the problem was with the word one, because we all know who the one was, or is, it's China. So, I mean, the fact is that there is, I think, we say China isn't building a road in Pakistan, Pakistan's building a road with the Chinese loan, but actually Chinese themselves are coming to build it. So, in Sri Lanka, they're already realizing the extraordinary economic cost of Chinese aid. The construction of Hambantota Port has become a white elephant around the Chinese government's neck. They're trying to do all sorts of debt equity swaps with the Chinese in order to be able to make it even halfway viable.
And keeping the agreement secret.
Well, that nothing is really entirely secret in Sri Lanka, as far as I understand. But maybe, yeah. Well, the fact is that there are transformations taking place in order to make it look even reasonably viable. So the fundamental questions you raised are valid questions, and they remain. For us, the sovereignty problem was an irritant in a way that perhaps it wasn't quite to the Afghans to the same degree, because we've had some fundamental, I mean, it's been an issue in our relationship with China and with Pakistan to, in a sense, if you must take an Afghan parallel, it'll be the way it was for the Afghans in the early 70s.
Yeah.
It's gone a long way down in salience in Afghanistan, the Durand Line, whereas for us, this has actually become even more inflamed with the passage of time. And finally, the thing about this whole One Belt, One Road concept is each country is asking itself, what do we gain out of it? And they've got answers. I mean, maybe Bangladesh, I'm sure Foreign Secretary Haq will tell us, can see tangibly certain benefits in new rail lines as the China, Bangladesh, India, Myanmar corridor, which they're going to spend some, which is part of the OBOR and the BRI. And all of that. But from our point of view, it's a bit hard to actually say what we can gain from it that we couldn't gain from other initiatives, whether ones we're leading ourselves or one in which we're just a part of as part of a sub-regional arrangement. So I think that if the Chinese really feel that for the overall viability and credibility of BRI, they want India to be an active part, they have to do more of a selling job. They have to come and market to us here why this is actually in our interest. It may be in the interest of Bangladesh and Sri Lanka in a way that it is not, apparently in the interest of India.
No, but let me pose the question I posed to Suhasini. Should we be worried? The point is that you have countries, smaller economies, clearly seeing merit. Let's take their assessment and say that they see merit in joining this initiative. They see some benefits coming out of this initiative. And then we see some troubles down the road. should we be worried? And what should be our approach be in terms of, should we be offering counter propositions? Should we, or we just can't? We are not in that position to do
No,
that.
I mean, first of all, we should not play dog in the manger. It's not our job to either disapprove or be unpleasant. If one country wants to do a project in a second country, it really should not be our problem. I think if we did, especially in our own neighborhood, we would look curmudgeonly, we'd look like the bullying big brother, all of these things that we have no interest in being. Secondly, when it comes to things like the long-term viability of these projects, I suspect many of them will result in one of two outcomes. Either a sense of appalled, belated discovery that the recipient country has acquired something larger than it is prepared to pay for, or a conviction that what has come from outside may have actually been more useful for China to build than for the receiving country to operate. And I think in time, a balance will be struck. You know, it's very interesting. During the time that we were massively for Aung San Suu Kyi, a totally different example but relevant, in the 90s, and the Chinese completely got into a love relationship with Myanmar, the junta. Many people in India thought we've lost. You know, we've done the right thing in principle. We've supported a democracy that's been defenestrated after a fair election, but we've lost Myanmar. What happened
Turned around so
later?
quickly, yeah?
Not only, apart from minor, the most significant thing is that the Myanmaris actually actively sought an Indian counterbalance to the overweeningly generous, if you like, presence of China. They decided that it was in their interest to have something other than one gigantic benefactor. That will be true of all our neighboring countries too. So why should we worry? I would not worry. I would not express disapproval. I certainly would not throw any obstacles, any spanners in the works. Let the Chinese do their project. Let the neighboring countries have what they want. And at the end of the day, we can sit back quietly and continue our own relationships. Finally, we can't afford anyway to do what the Chinese are doing. We don't have the kind of surplus they have.
No, but I'll come back to that. And I think we need to think about the partnerships and coalitions that can create alternatives, and I'll come to that in the next round. Foreign Secretary Haq, you have heard this conversation, a very Indian conversation on what's happening in the region. Sitting in Bangladesh, of course, you may think that we are overstating the perils or the dangers of many of these large infrastructure projects. What is your take on this?
Thank you very much. Before I do that, let me just flag that here it's a state versus state, and we're leaving out the people. What the people wants of this region, that's also very important. And before joining the BRI, we had an intensive discussion at the civil society level, at various levels, and we realized that they're possibly better to be in the BRI, but also not excluding the initiatives that the other neighbor is exclusively taking. Now, before I go into the BRI, let me flag that before BRI proposal came in, we were discussing about this India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and China corridor very intensively. I remember back in 2014, we all of us were in Kunming discussing as to how this economic corridor could be extensively beneficial, linking Kolkata with Kunming. And we were very optimistic, and we thought this is a big opportunity for us to address some of our limitation in terms of our small geographical disposition, and also connect some of the economic hubs on the way.
But the corridor would run through more of Bangladesh territory than of any other country.
Yes, but it would actually link Kolkata with Kunming.
Correct. But
So
through
that's much more
a large
important.
stretch of
Absolutely, sir. And then we had long discussions. We're still discussing. The last meeting was in Kolkata. So we were, at one stage, we were also disappointed. I'll be very frank, that spending so much of our resources and time and energy and having the rationale in place, we couldn't do it. So naturally, we had to look for alternatives. And for us, as a country, we are in the stage of making quick economic progress. And for that, what we need is resources, the wealth. And internally, we have our limitations of generating wealth. We had been pursuing a conservative policy in terms of borrowing from the market. there's two reasons. One is that there were times when nobody wanted to lend us because they thought that Bangladesh would not be able to pay back. Our history of 46 years suggests that we have never faltered on payment to anyone. And now that the confidence is coming back, and since Bangladesh is growing, we were looking outside for bringing in extra resources to do a quick upgradation of our infrastructure, not only road, but also railway and others. And in that, we have a very good collaboration with India. Some of the resources, the loan that India has given us has been used to revive some of the old links that we had in this continent between Bangladesh and India. And I remember my young days, we used to see the train coming to Gualando from all the way from India. So that was extremely useful. And our generation who are younger, we thought that let's bring that era back where we'll have much more integration, much more interaction, much more mobility between us and India, and we look forward to that. But having said this, we also realize that we have to look beyond South Asia in terms of linking us with Southeast Asia and Far East, also with Europe. And this possibility, because there's already, where India is also a partner, East-West corridor. And we had a discussion both with Thailand and with the Indian Foreign Secretaries that if we are allowed to hook into that East-West corridor, then we are virtually Bangladesh linked with Southeast Asia, Far East, even up to Vietnam and Laos and other places. So that will open up a different avenues for our own activities, and it will be also a different Bangladesh, which can deny its geographical disposition. And in the whole process, we have always been guided by the people's desire to link up. These infrastructures are not only for mobility of goods and services, it's also mobility of people.
Yeah.
Sorry, this is one thing with which we had a long debate in Kunming. He said, I distinctly remember saying to the Chinese that once we have the road, what you want to do with the road?
Exactly.
Correct.
And they said, trucks will move, buses will move. I said, but people will also move. What you do with it? Because they have a very conservative approach towards mobility of people. And I said, that we have to bring into our agreement. So eventually, we agreed, or also with our Indian colleagues, that it will be people-to-people contact. It will not be mobility, it will not be migration, it's a people-to-people contact. But what is that? It is basically freeing up the frontiers for people's mobility. And that will add huge wealth to not only South Asia, globally. And this morning we were listening, sitting here, about the leadership. In the absence of all these geopolitical changes that's happening, what role South Asia could play together in the global arena. I think we have huge potential to do that, but before that we have to settle what we want. We want control or we want opening up. Thank you.
I think that's an important point. I think economic integration efforts will eventually hit a political wall. So I think that political consensus amongst various actors is extremely important. Can projects like BRI, India's own Asia-Africa Growth Corridor and others, are we investing enough in the political dimension to it?
Well, I think political will obviously has to drive the whole lot. And here I would like to comment on the issue of FTAs. FTAs do work. And I say this because as a practitioner, all the countries that we've been talking about, whether it is the rail links into Bangladesh, in times of disaster, in times of normal travel, whether it is the road into Myanmar that was inaugurated in 2001. This was the road on which General Slim withdrew in the 1940s. And it was the first external link of Northeast India with Southeast Asia. Whether it was the flight that was inaugurated between Bangkok and Bodh Gaya, and which flew full from the very first day. Our visa applications at Thailand, I was ambassador to Thailand at that time, went in exactly in proportion to the number of seats. So given the political will, yes, there can be opening up. Will there be glitches? There will always be glitches. Typically an FTA takes about 2 years to really kick in because the structure the information about how it is to be handled has to permeate down to that last customs officer. The paperwork has to be done. The documentation has to be prepared. With Sri Lanka, this was when Mr. Vajpayee was the Prime Minister. The offer was made at a SAARC summit because everybody complained that SAFTA was moving too slowly. And Mr. Vajpayee said, anybody who wants to negotiate bilaterally is welcome to India. Within a month, President Chandrika had her negotiating team in India, led by Lal Jayawardene. Within 3 months, the framework agreement was signed. 1 year negotiating 6,000 tariff lines, and thereafter the agreement was operationalized in March 2000. Within 2 years, Sri Lanka's exports to India had doubled. Now, given the asymmetries, obviously India's exports also increased, but the objective was served of diversifying Sri Lanka's production, manufacturing, and industrial base. FTAs do work. ASEAN has been a little slow. They sort of took 10 years to agree to cooperate economically after they were established, and there have been issues as well. I think all free trade agreements have issues, but that does not mean that they are to be dumped. I know it's fashionable to say that right now countries are sort of pulling back, but international trade, I think, is approximately 60% on the basis of preferential trading agreements. And in terms of India's equations, where we have these neighborhood relationships, and I distinguish between neighbors and neighborhood. Neighbors are countries with whom we have a boundary. Our neighborhood is a wider ambit, and I was very happy to hear the Bangladesh Foreign Secretary talk about Bangladesh's own need to look beyond, because South Asia, quite frankly, is a questionable identity. It's a regional box which has been created, whereas India's actual interests go well beyond. At one point, the Mediterranean, security in the Mediterranean mattered because the bulk of India's trade went through the Mediterranean. Today, the South China Sea is of direct and vital interest to India's economic well-being. And I did a piece on redefining India's neighborhood on this. If there's an interest, I could certainly pass it on to you. Likewise, with regard to the institutions, I think it's really a part of India's learning curve on regionalism and multilateralism, which started with SAARC and which we entered with a high degree of reluctance and hesitation. But I think today India is very alive to the fact that its neighborhood is far wider than any regional box. Likewise, ASEAN. Now, the ASEAN 10, of them, 5 of them have an Indian Ocean front.
Correct.
And I think that interest also is something that needs to be pursued.
Part of the IORA ambit.
And yeah, now coming, I am sorry.
That was an ad break, sorry.
I do apologize.
That's connectivity.
That's connectivity and also not switching it off.
At least someone was trying to connect.
Yeah.
So let me at this time.
I just have one thing. On the Belt and Road.
Okay.
I want to raise a very basic question. What is it? Does anybody know? So Hasini talked about the lack of clarity and so on. Many of the projects started long before the concept of Belt and Road came up. So, and while there are very, very ambitious ones being planned. So in a sense, it's really a consolidated packaging of all China's infrastructure projects in its periphery and beyond, some ongoing, some planned, as part of its overall geostrategic vision for itself and its ambitions. The economics are yet to be spelt out. Now, China has been very persuasive in trying to say why there are good reasons for India, among other countries, to join. The questions are what are the terms of the financing? And as we talked about Sri Lanka and some other countries, is it in the terms of grants, equity, loans? How sustainable is the debt that would be incurred? Again, Sri Lanka and Hambantota come to mind, given the problems that many other participants have also experienced. And what are the macroeconomics in the context of the Chinese economy itself, given their recent decline in outward investment, China's overall and short-term external debt, its import requirements, and the liquidity of its reserves. There are questions with regard to the numbers over here. Also, how does China intend to synchronize its statements as a responsible power? It has offered mediation in some cases, with its behavior on the ground involving the unilateral alteration of the status quo. Again, a very basic diplomatic principle, and the violation of its commitments. Will it play by the rules, or will it keep shifting goalposts? So there's clearly a lack of sensitivity and respect, and certainly with regard to India's core concerns on territorial integrity and sovereignty. I would question Suhasini's point that it's a 19th century concept. Net, ultimately, it's like the whole debate on soft power.
It's a legacy from them. It's
Joseph Nye wrote an article on soft power. Everybody talks about soft power about being the thrust of diplomacy. Ultimately, it's a question of a nation's capabilities, comprehensive capabilities, and comprehensive national power.
Great. So let me invite questions from the audience. You can attract my attention. I see a hand there. Can someone get a mic to the lady here? Please identify yourself and pose your question either to the panel or to a specific speaker. There you go.
Hi, my name is Naishka. I'm with CNBC. I wanted to touch on one aspect that all of you have mentioned, which is related to the Belt and Road, and more broadly, this topic of competition between China and India in South Asia, in India's own backyard. We've seen concerns about competition in the Indian Ocean. We've seen India potentially looking to buy naval drones to offset rising Chinese influence there. I just wanted to ask, and I'll try to make this as succinct as possible. We've seen countries, Mauritius, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, have Chinese money. These are also countries where India has historical, political ties to. I know, Shashi, you said, we should let China do their thing. Countries may naturally become cautious of too much Chinese influence, but how can India really compete with Chinese money coming into the region? We know that India is concerned. They've taken steps to counter the Chinese influence. So I don't think it's fair to say that India should just sort of sit back and let Chinese projects continue. So this is a question for everyone. What exactly should India do in terms of foreign policy?
Shashi, let's start with you. What should India do in terms of foreign policy? Are we heading for a political conflict?
I don't see foreign policy in terms of competing with countries. I'm not interested in competing with China. China can do its own thing. I'm not going to sit back. I mean, if I were in the driver's seat, I'd want to be very active myself in terms of our own relationships with these countries, which have a compound of historical, cultural, and geopolitical factors in addition to economic ones. It's possible that China can steal a march on us in terms of, for example, the amount of surplus capital they can invest, which obviously we don't. But we can do our own thing in areas which will have their own value to the other country. Even, for example, take the issue of development. The Chinese give far more money in grant aid than we do. Most of ours is actually loans, though it's at a peppercorn rate of interest. It still is loans, at least nominally. We are expecting these recipient countries in Africa and so on to pay us back. But nonetheless, it doesn't mean that we should stop development because the Chinese can give so much more. What we're doing is highly appreciated. We're sought after. I've witnessed foreign ministers from African countries coming and clamoring for certain things from us. That's the rule of the game. It's not only a competition. It's not zero-sum. Let China do its own thing, and let's do our own.
Suhasini.
I just wanted to say, be the un-China. That's the answer. There's no point playing a game in which we definitely don't have an advantage. What is the point of us saying we want to counter every project China does? Even today, we might have a lot in India sneering at the Hambantota project, yet the government of India has now bid officially for the Matala airport over there. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the fact is that we keep banging our head against this wall because we keep wanting to be somebody else. On the other hand, there is no country in South Asia, and I disagree. I think South Asia is a very natural concept. There's no part of South Asia or of the SAARC region in particular where you don't go as an Indian and realize there is a special connection. There is something that binds us together. There's no part of South Asia with which some part of India does not share a language, does not share food, does not share music, does not share a sense of humor. And this includes Pakistan. In fact, Pakistan perhaps more than a lot of other countries in the region. So the fact is that if we keep pushing away what is clearly our advantage and keep wanting to do, wanting to play a game or be in a race where we are clearly the second player, I think we are setting ourselves up for disappointment. On the other hand, there are a lot of projects we can do, and this includes Africa. where India is at an advantage. The Solar Alliance is one great example. There are a lot of places where low-cost technology for the third world is something India does better than anyone else. There are a lot of challenges that we share in terms of the weather, in terms of the poverty, in terms of needing low-cost solutions that other countries don't have an advantage on. And I think we have to play to our strengths. We've done it the other way for a little too long, and I think it's time that we accept what our strengths are and play to them instead.
So both of you believe Pax Seneca and Pax Indica can exist together?
Very much so.
Okay.
The elephant and the dragon can dance together.
Okay. Let me get the ambassador in and then I'll come to you.
Yeah, no, I entirely agree with Shashi. There's no question of competing with China. Why should we? India has done some things right. It's had a very long-standing program of cooperation with developing countries, and it has done things that not China and not many other countries do. It has helped develop capacities, human capacities in these countries. How many of you have heard of the ITEC program? Nobody. And yet, there are people in these countries who would say it is because of ITEC that I have got where I am, the India Technical and Economic Cooperation. The structure has been changed to now what's called the Development Partnership Administration. So human capacity has been created, sharing of appropriate technology, and very favorable loans. Again, Shashi talked about peppercorn interest. I might say that, and I think as our colleague from Bangladesh would know, and other countries, in some cases, India has deliberately structured these as rupee loans, so that the problems of devaluation would not, and the rate of, change in the rate of exchange would not affect the borrowing country. And this has been consciously done. We show people the shop floor, even when we give them defense equipment. We show people the shop floor. We do not just show them the product. I think this is India's openness. So I don't believe that the question.
So there is an India development model, and we must continue to make that stronger, more robust, and
Also, we
proliferate.
should not be paranoid, not just with what China does with our neighborhood, but also with our neighbors. There are 3 common neighbors that India and China have: Myanmar, Bhutan, Nepal. And each of us has our respective relationships with these countries. Myanmar in particular, where, as Shashi rightly mentioned, China had a certain in,
We'll have
but
to be quick now.
the Myanmaris were very conscious of the fact that they needed something to counterbalance China,
So sitting in Bangladesh,
including the junta.
what do you think Indian foreign policy should be?
I'm not in a position to say anything, but I think India should continue to create more friends in Asia. Since we are talking about Asian century, and this morning we were listening to primarily to the Indian colleagues who are saying that we have the potential to lead the world. Now, if that were to happen, and if by 2025 we think that Asia can produce over 50% of the global wealth, then it has to play a different game.
Yeah.
The confrontational game wouldn't lead us anywhere. It will only divide Asia, and that will possibly lead to much more difficulties. As you know, that conflict will cost more, both covert and overt conflict, than cooperation. I think that's the path.
So I will take 4 interventions from the audience, and only 4. Short ones, please, and then we'll do a mad rush with all of the speakers trying to answer all of them quickly, or some of them at least.
Yeah, hi, Srinivas from Deutsche Bank. This is for Mr. Tharoor. If the internationalization of the renminbi was really phase 1 of a project from China, and the OBOR is phase 2, and these are like emerging trends that are coming up. Obviously, we need to collaborate, that goes without saying. But again, from a position of kind of managing our longer-term strategic interests, what should we actually do?
We have 2 questions on that from that column there, and we'll come to you after that.
Dietrich Reetz from Germany, from Berlin, South Asia researcher. regarding China, I'm a bit surprised to hear that now the question is not to compete with China, because not so long ago there was actually, and even under the current government, talk about cooperating with China, which is somewhat slightly different, especially considering strategically that the gap in infrastructure building in India cannot even be closed without the extensive overlay of money that exists on the Chinese side, even given the fact that both of them actually sit on the same bank.
There's another hand there. So we need China for our infrastructure, and we should be cooperating with them.
I'm Khalid Narsani from Kabul Hub, Afghanistan. As we already know that three countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, have documented differences, especially Afghanistan with Pakistan and Pakistan with India. Projects like TAPI, which is one of the largest gas pipelines, what do you think such projects, does the economic mutual beneficial projects like TAPI and similar other projects, can that be an answer to some of the political differences that we have within this region? And if yes, how many of such projects is India planning to undertake? Thank you.
We have the gentleman there with the mic already.
Thank you, Rajiv. Taking on from Suhasini's point, and I found that and it's about soft power. I think I just came back from Myanmar and Indonesia. In Myanmar, I saw Munna Michael, Bollywood film, running to packed houses in the main streets, of course. And in Myanmar, in Indonesia, it was about Mika Singh's concert. That was obviously mainstream. The point is really, in a world where America and Trump are retreating from the rest of the world, right? What is the opportunity available to us to leverage the soft power? And Sashi, you've waxed eloquent about this, so I want to know a little bit more. And maybe, Ms. Ponappa, if you could just weigh in as well. Thank you so much.
And the final intervention from the lady here, please. Sorry, this is the fifth one.
Li Xing from Caixin Media in China. Actually, it's very highly informative to hear from the Indian perspective, which we don't hear so much within China, especially on the Belt and Road Initiative. So my first question is, if I can flip that.
Only one question.
Only one? Okay.
Yes.
What it takes for the Belt and Road Initiative to make India considering join it?
One belt, one road, one question. Now, one question to each of you. So let's start with Suhasini. You can pick up a couple of them, but you have a minute.
What is the one thing China can do to make India consider it is to show that China cares about the sovereignty issue more than anything else, because everything else is something that can be done with diplomacy and can be worked around. But I think the sovereignty issue is something China has to engage very straight. It's not just about saying that, we could discuss various options. It has to be very clearly set out that China cares about India's sovereignty concerns, just as China expects India to care about its sovereignty concerns. There was a question over there about you saying with the US retreating, what are the sort of opportunities to leverage? I think there's a lot of opportunities and there are a lot of challenges. It's going to be a whole new world if the US does in fact retreat, not just from South China Sea issues and the East Asian region, but also for us from the West Asian region. If America more and more hands over or delegates power in the region to local satraps or local powers. We've seen with Afghanistan, for example, the US saying we're not just leaving yet. However, on the ground, what we've essentially seen is 3,000 odd more troops. That's also going to have an impact on India in particular. So I think we have to really assess the whole new world that would come out if the US does in fact retrench its position in a lot of these places. Interestingly, you spoke about soft power in Myanmar. Let me tell you, we have soft power there, but so does China. And I realized that in Yangon last year when I think I reached there and all that you could get anywhere in Myanmar was mooncakes because it was part of the harvest festival season. This wasn't something that was local to Myanmar before. So we're seeing it in many ways everywhere.
Foreign Secretary.
Thank you very much. Once again, it was interesting to see that we have brought the geopolitics to the project level. And that was a little frustrating. I think we need to raise above this project-centric discussions and look at the bigger picture. That's one. The second observation is we are looking as an Asian country, we're looking within ourselves. Why can't we look beyond Asia? If we are thinking of leadership, we have to think about beyond Asia. And if you can do that, and if you can do that together, then you will see that some of the issues that is coming out as a strong sovereignty issue will disappear. I was thinking, and Mr. Shashi Tharoor would be better placed to answer, is that how this continent looked, say in 1800, 1700, where everybody thought that if you want to be rich, if you want to make wealth, come over to this continent. And did we had a similar geopolitical concern between countries, or it was a different era?
But look what happened to us after that, because we did not have concerns.
If that was something ideal, we might used to replicate part of it. But I think as Bangladesh, we would like not to go through a process where conflict will determine everything, including our foreign policy. We would like to cooperate. There will always be hiccups. We have huge issues and between our neighbors and neighborhoods. Recently, Myanmar has pushed 1 million of Rohingya, their own nationals, onto our soil. We are still struggling with. We haven't gone into a fight with them, despite provocations. We are trying to resolve it peacefully. Even within our own country, people think this is a stupid way of exercising foreign policy. In fact, people are saying it's an absolute failure in the foreign policy arena that a neighboring country pushed 1 million people in 1 month over 41 kilometer corridor, and we could do nothing. And the Prime Minister thinks that that is something we will solve through a peaceful manner.
So diplomacy and
absolutely,
conversations
through
are
peaceful
important.
manner. So Europe was almost in a
So
war footing.
we have crossed the red light is flashing.
One issue and an example. When Europe almost were in the war footing, when they had 1 million people, they mobilized, like Hungary, Poland mobilized military to stop people coming in. We haven't done it. So there are ways to resolve it. Not that it will always go in our favor, but we are against conflict. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, a few bullet points.
No bullet points, 1 minute, because I'm 2 minutes up.
One
The hall
minute,
needs to be
1 minute.
vacated.
Okay. 18th century, there was a certain template. I think India took on too much debt after that, which is why colonialism happened. Of course, we should cooperate. There's no question about that. And I think the core question that I think the organizers had wanted addressed was, would we contest or cooperate? I think there's going to be a bit of both. But as long as there is sensitivity to red lines, to core interests, they need not clash. Soft power, there are huge opportunities for India. I cannot overstate how wide the field is. But you've got to have the resources, the people, the imagination, and the creativity in order to put these in place. But soft power alone is not going to get you there. What would make India join BRI? I think Suhasini has already answered the question. The reason we didn't go was because of neglect of India's sovereignty issues, and I think that could be taken care of. The US is already in retreat. Many countries, at least at the track 2 level in Southeast Asia, have written off the US as a dependable partner, and the real question is, how do they dance with China? To the question from our Afghan friend about mega projects, I go back to my earlier point about building blocks. You've got to have that local consensus. You've got to have the willingness. And that's true also of the Iran-Pakistan-India pipeline. A question that gets raised is, how will you ensure security in Balochistan? What will it take to do it? Now, hopefully, these are things that can be addressed.
And we will address that in the next World Economic Forum.
After 39 years in government, I would have to say that every problem does not have a solution. But you have to work at it.
I'll try to be brief with 3 questions on China, one on a mega project from Afghanistan to India, one on soft power, sort of a sentence each. I think China's strategic vision clearly is to establish itself as a superpower. And we're going to have to contend with that, learn to live with it. We certainly have no interest in trying to thwart it because we can't in any case. On the question of No, but let's be realistic on the question of cooperation versus competition. Competition is irrelevant as far as cooperation is concerned. I have actually had the unfashionable view that we should be cooperating on many more areas than we have done. For example, we have exactly the same interests in keeping open the sea lanes of communication from East Africa and the Gulf past us towards China. Why shouldn't we have had joint patrols against anti-piracy patrols? Why didn't we work together on navigating those oceans? We don't. We don't, and in fact, it's silly that we don't. There are areas for cooperation at a level of detail that we should be exploring. In the meantime, not getting into competition is better than nothing else. To our Afghan friend, let's be very honest and say that as far as this TAPI is concerned, it'll run through Pakistan, and that requires us to be able to trust that Pakistan will not turn off the tap whenever it suits them, or that they can control the terrorists who want to interrupt the pipeline when it suits them. So for us, it's far too big an investment to make in the absence of trust. There has to be a better relationship before we can really be enthusiastic about supporting something like that. And you must also know that history does not show that economics can trump geopolitical considerations. France and Germany had excellent economic relations before the First World War. Nothing has changed. It actually ties into the soft power question as well. You mentioned opportunities in Myanmar and so on. In China, Dangal and Three Idiots have been the two biggest hit films of the last 2 years. And the fact is that that's also the period that has witnessed the greatest increase in hostility, or at least rhetorical hostility between India and China. So soft power, economics, all these are good, they're important. They thrive best when there is a basic situation of normality and an increase in trust. When trust is down, situations aren't normal, none of those things will trump geopolitics.
Great. I think that's a good note to end this conversation on. Trust is the word that Asia needs to build its infrastructure, to create trading and economic opportunities. Please join me in thanking the panel for their vigorous remarks on this very important issue. Thank you very much.